Welcome back to The Explainer. I am so glad you're here. Today, we're unpacking a really complex, incredibly polarizing, and honestly, just absolutely fascinating subject. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. For decades now, this institution has basically acted as the ultimate global firefighter, stepping in when national economies quite literally go up in flames. But how does it actually work, and why is its track record so fiercely debated? Well, let's dive right into this. To really grasp the intense, sheer panic of the IMF stepping in during a massive national financial meltdown, consider this quote. When a country's economy completely crashes and millions of terrified people realize they've lost their life savings, crafting a bailout is described as like trying to redecorate Versailles whilst the mob were outside with flaming torches. I mean, wow. It's pure chaos, the stakes are totally existential, and the pressure, unimaginable. So here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, the birth of the IMF. 2, how the IMF works. 3, the cost of conditionality. 4, global crises and bailouts. And finally, number 5, the future of the fund. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the birth of the IMF, from Bretton Woods to floating currencies. You know, the IMF was this incredibly ambitious post-World War II project. Looking at this timeline, you can really see its evolution. Back in 1944, delegates from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods to stabilize the whole international monetary system, and that officially created the IMF. By 45, it was up and running, and then in 1947, the first general agreement on tariffs and trade came into force. Now, originally, the IMF managed a fixed exchange rate system, right? The US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, but check out 1971. The famous Nixon shock abruptly ends the dollar's convertibility into gold, and that just collapses the fixed exchange rate system. Literally overnight, the IMF had to shift from enforcing a really rigid gold standard to navigating a completely modern, highly volatile world of floating currencies. And that brings us to section 2, how the IMF works, the anatomy of a global institution. Okay, so to really understand how the IMF wields its influence today, we absolutely have to look at its structural machinery. And I want you to focus on just one single number, 24. The IMF has a near universal membership. We're talking 185 to 190 countries, depending on the exact year of the data, but its day-to-day business is handled by an executive board made up of just 24 executive directors. Think about that for a second. Just 24 people are making the crucial daily decisions for almost the entire planet. And this setup brilliantly illustrates exactly how that power is actually distributed. See, the IMF uses a quota-based voting hierarchy, which is primarily based on a country's economic size. If you look at the top row, wealthy nations, places like the US, Japan, Germany, the UK, and France, they are single constituency. That means they have high influence. They each get their very own dedicated executive director. Now glance at the bottom row. Developing countries in African, Caribbean, and Middle Eastern groups, they fall into multi-constituency blocks. Dozens of countries literally have to share a single director, which gives them significantly lower influence. It's a stark, undeniable power imbalance, and it is baked right into the institution's DNA. Which naturally leads to section 3, the cost of conditionality, medicine or poison? This is where we get into the central, and by far the most fiercely debated, mechanism of IMF lending. Think of this as the strict rules of the ultimate economic emergency room. Conditionality refers to the policy changes, like strict macroeconomic stabilization and severe structural adjustments, that the IMF explicitly requires in exchange for its temporary financial lending. The IMF doesn't just cut a check for billions of dollars with no questions asked. No way. There are unprecedented strings attached to these bailouts. A sovereign country actually has to agree to radically alter its own internal economic policies just to get the desperately needed cash. And as you can imagine, this requirement births an absolutely fierce political controversy. On one hand, you've got the IMF's view. They argue that these tight monetary policies and necessary reforms are, well, strictly required to restore stability and actually ensure the loan gets repaid. Makes sense, right? But conversely, critics are quick to point out that these non-negotiable conditions lead to a massive loss of national sovereignty. They argue it forces devastating structural austerity upon highly vulnerable populations and can actually make poverty rates even worse. So, whether you view conditionality as necessary medicine or toxic poison, well, that often depends entirely on which end of the bailout you're standing on. Let's see this in practice in Section 4, Global Crises and Bailouts, the Firefighter in Action. So what actually happens when that theory meets reality? Let's look at some historical case studies that stress-tested these controversial methods during real-world panics. First up, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. Back in October 1982, Mexico announced a sudden debt moratorium, and that sent absolute shockwaves for the global banking system. The IMF immediately swooped in with a $1.5 billion bailout. But, as we know, strings attached. This intervention came with the strict imposition of what became known as the Washington Consensus. And boy, did this set the stage for decades of intense economic clashes. We saw a massive backlash against these neoliberal structural reforms, sparking a highly polarized debate between right-wing and left-wing economic observers over the true human cost of IMF intervention. Next, we jump forward to the 1997 Asian financial crisis. This was a massive, massive stress test for the institution. Financial contagion rapidly tore through Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and the Philippines. The IMF stepped in, demanding strict bank recapitalization along some really sky-high interest rates. But the results? They were fiercely criticized. Instead of calming the waters, the IMF's strict corporate governance prescriptions were heavily blamed for actually deepening recessions and pushing poverty rates even higher. It got so bad that critics literally dubbed this entire event the IMF's second meltdown. And then, of course, we have 2008. The global financial crisis triggered massive social dislocation and laid bare the inherent, really dangerous volatility of global financial markets. And unlike previous crises that were largely isolated to emerging markets, this one, it hit the absolute core of global finance. It highlighted the totally unpredictable nature of modern markets, it demonstrated the hard limits of the IMF's power to prevent a disaster, and it brought renewed, incredibly urgent calls for wholesale institutional reform. All of this brings us to our final section, the future of the fund, adapting to a new century. So how exactly does an institution built for 1944 handle 21st century emergencies? Well, the recent pandemic provides a pretty stark example. During the initial COVID-19 outbreak, the IMF was caught completely off guard by the unprecedented global nature of the shock. Because there was just an absolute lack of historical precedent in their archives, the IMF stumbled. They actually initially lagged behind the rapid, massive interventions that were being orchestrated by the G20 and their sister institution, the World Bank. The global firefighter was quite simply just too slow to gear up for a crisis it didn't recognize. But moving forward, the IMF is genuinely attempting to adapt to entirely new types of threats. Now, what's really interesting here is their surprising, aggressive pivot into climate change modeling. They're actually proposing a $50 per ton carbon tax for advanced economies by 2030. They're rapidly expanding their analytical toolkit to mitigate macro-financial climate risks, which really proves they are trying to evolve far beyond just managing currency pegs and traditional debt defaults. But here's the thing, adapting to new threats just isn't enough anymore. The very structure of the institution itself is under intense pressure to change. Here are the two major reform proposals currently on the table. Step 1, transfer quotas and voting shares away from historically wealthy nations and toward emerging markets like Brazil, India, and China, to actually reflect the reality of the modern global economy. And step 2, fundamentally overhaul that 24-member executive board we talked about earlier to drastically improve transparency and accountability, legitimacy in the eyes of developing nations. So what does this all mean? We are left looking at the very foundation of global finance and asking this: can a 1944 institution survive the crises of tomorrow? It's a genuinely provocative question. Does the global economic emergency room just need to update its policies, or does it need to be entirely rebuilt from the ground up to handle a volatile, totally interconnected 21st century? I want you to really chew on that as you process everything we've covered today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.